It was a typical day, or so it seemed. The city buzzed with the usual noise, cars honking, people rushing to and from work, the soft hum of life moving forward. But in the midst of it all, something happened that would change two lives forever. One moment, everything seemed ordinary. The next, a chain of events was set in motion that no one could have predicted. A woman was struggling, caught in a moment of panic and uncertainty. She stood on the side of the road, her face pale and tense, eyes wide with fear. The world around her moved on, oblivious to her distress. Cars zipped past, people walked by, too absorbed in their own lives to notice. But not everyone. There was a man nearby, someone who had no reason to stop, no obligation to get involved. He was just like anyone else, going about his day, minding his own business. But something inside him, something deeper, urged him to help. Maybe it was a gut feeling, or maybe it was simply the right thing to do. Whatever it was, he couldn't ignore it. As he approached, he saw the woman's struggle. Her hands were shaking, her breath short. The distress was evident. Without hesitation, he offered a hand, a simple gesture that could have been the difference between panic and relief. She looked up at him, eyes wide with surprise, but there was a glimmer of hope in her gaze. Her words were rushed, almost frantic. She didn't need to explain everything. He could tell there was something wrong, something urgent. With no questions asked, he helped her. No promises were made, no expectations set. He simply did what felt right. It wasn't about recognition or reward, just the human connection, the willingness to step in when someone else is in need. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, and the woman, now calm, offered a brief thank you before walking away. He watched her go, and for a moment he stood still, wondering if he'd done enough, if anything would come of it. But the next day, everything changed. He woke up to a world that seemed a little bit different. It wasn't just any other day. Something in the air was charged with a sense of anticipation, though he couldn't quite explain why. He checked his phone, expecting the usual routine of messages and missed calls. But there was something unexpected waiting for him. A message. No, not just any message. It was a letter, but not a letter like any he had received before. The words on the page were simple, but the meaning behind them? That was a whole different story. He read it over and over, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. How could this be? How could what had seemed like a small, simple act of kindness turn into something so much more? The letter didn't just thank him for his help, it offered him something far more valuable. Something that no one could have predicted. But the details, the exact nature of this unexpected reward, were still unclear. He had no idea how or why this was happening. All he knew was that his life, which had been so ordinary just the day before, was about to take a sharp turn into the unknown. What did this letter mean? What was the reward? And what would happen next? These were the questions that lingered in his mind as he stood there, staring at the paper in his hands. There was no way to know, not yet. But one thing was certain, everything was about to change, and his life would never be the same again. Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you speechless. You won't believe what's coming, and neither did he. The letter was simple, yet it carried a weight that felt heavier than anything he had ever held before. He sat there, frozen, staring at the words printed on the page. He wasn't sure what he expected, maybe just a simple thank you or a generic message of gratitude. But what he read was something else entirely, something that set his heart racing with confusion, excitement, and a hint of trepidation. The letter had been addressed to him by name. There was no return address, just a single line that read, "For your kindness, there is a reward waiting." The rest of the letter was cryptic, filled with vague references to opportunities and paths he had never considered. It spoke of a debt repaid, of what goes around comes around, and of how sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the most unexpected outcomes. The handwriting was neat, but there was something about it that seemed unusual. The letters were perfect, each one formed with careful precision. But the ink had a slightly faded quality, as though the words had been written some time ago, only now finding their way to him. It felt like an invitation, but to what? What was the reward? And how could his small act of helping a stranger lead to something so significant? He set the letter down, trying to push aside the growing sense of unease. He had always believed in the idea of karma, that what you put out into the world would eventually come back to you. But this felt different. This wasn't just about being a decent person. This was something much bigger, something he didn't understand. The more he thought about it, the more questions piled up. What was the woman's connection to all of this? She had been in distress, yes, but who was she really? He had only spoken to her for a few minutes, enough time to offer his help, but never enough to ask for her name or get any sense of who she was. She had been so caught up in whatever was happening that she hadn't even offered an explanation. She just walked away, and now, this mysterious letter was showing up in his life. His mind wandered back to the moment he helped her. He had just been walking down the street when he noticed her standing by the side of the road, her face tense with panic. At first, he thought she might have been in some kind of trouble, maybe even needing help with her car. But as he got closer, he saw that she wasn't hurt, at least not physically. Her distress wasn't from an obvious, visible source, it was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. Her eyes were wide, her hands shaking as she looked around, almost like she was waiting for something or someone. When he had approached, she had barely registered his presence at first, too absorbed in her own fear to notice anyone else. But when their eyes met, there was a brief moment of recognition. A flash of understanding. She didn't say much, just mumbled something about needing to get somewhere important, and that she was lost. There was no time to ask for more details, no time to question her. He just helped her get her bearings, giving directions and reassuring her that it was going to be okay. And then she was gone, walking away without so much as a second glance, like it had all been nothing. But now, this letter, it felt like the answers were just out of reach. He needed to know more. Who was she? What had she been running from? But even as he asked himself these questions, he realized that it didn't matter. The letter had arrived, and whatever this reward was, it was connected to that moment, to that choice he made. He couldn't ignore it now. The curiosity gnawed at him, and he knew he couldn't just sit back and wait for things to unfold. He needed to take action. He scanned the letter again, looking for any hidden clues or signs, something that might point him in the right direction. The only thing that stood out was a single line at the end: "The reward is closer than you think." What did that mean? Was it a metaphor? A hint? He couldn't make sense of it. He had a sense of where the reward might be. It wasn't just about money or material things. He had no idea what this reward could be, but something in the back of his mind whispered that it was something more profound, something that could change everything. It was like the universe had drawn him into something bigger than he could comprehend, and the only way to find out was to follow the trail. The thought of venturing into the unknown, of stepping outside of his comfort zone, brought a mix of excitement and anxiety. But what choice did he have? The letter had already found its way to him, and now, he had to find out what it all meant. So, he decided. He would follow the letter's cryptic message. He had to. But where would it lead him? And would he be ready for whatever he found? The next day, he took the first step. He retraced his path from the day before, walking along the same streets, trying to remember every detail from that brief encounter. He passed the same shops, the same street corners, the same trees that lined the road. He felt like he was looking at everything through a new lens, as though everything around him held some secret he hadn't noticed before. When he reached the spot where he had met the woman, he paused. Nothing had changed. The street was still as busy as ever, cars rushing by, people going about their lives, oblivious to the moment that had altered his reality. He stood there, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. No sign, no clue, just the usual rhythm of the city. He waited for what felt like hours, but still, there was no indication of where he was supposed to go next. His excitement began to turn into frustration. Had he misunderstood the letter? Was this all some kind of mistake? He was about to give up when a soft voice behind him interrupted his thoughts. Looking for something? He turned around quickly, his heart skipping a beat. There, standing just a few feet away, was the woman from the day before. She was different, somehow calmer, more composed. She wasn't in a rush anymore, and there was a look of knowing in her eyes, as if she had been waiting for him all along. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The words caught in his throat. He had so many questions, but he didn't know where to start. She smiled, as though she understood his confusion. "I see you got my letter," she said softly. The world seemed to tilt in that moment. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was part of something much bigger. He knew it now. But what was it? And what did she want from him? Before he could ask anything, she turned and began walking away, without a word, leaving him standing there, caught between confusion and intrigue. And once again, he was left with more questions than answers. But this time, he wasn't going to let it go. He couldn't. He had to find out what this was all about. The mystery was just beginning, and he was in deeper than he realized. What did this woman know? What was she trying to tell him? And why had she been the one to help him discover a truth he hadn't even known he was looking for? There were more pieces to the puzzle, and now he had to put them together. The answers were just out of reach, but something told him that the closer he got, the more he would understand. The woman's sudden appearance, and then her swift departure, left him in a state of utter confusion. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, processing everything that had happened, trying to make sense of the fleeting encounter. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced through 100 different possibilities. Was this all just a coincidence, or was there something much larger at play? He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let it go. His thoughts drifted back to the letter, its cryptic message still echoing in his mind. The reward is closer than you think. It felt like a riddle, one that had been placed in his hands to solve. But how? Where was he supposed to go from here? He had no answers, only more questions. The weight of the unknown hung heavily over him, each unanswered question making the air feel thicker, heavier. He walked through the city streets, lost in thought, replaying the scene with the woman over and over. She hadn't seemed like a stranger. There had been something about her, something familiar, even though he had never seen her before. The way she had looked at him, almost knowingly, had unsettled him. It was as if she knew what was coming, like she was a part of something that he hadn't even begun to understand. As he walked, he noticed other people's faces he had seen countless times, but never really paid attention to. He wondered if any of them could be part of the mystery. Was there a secret network, a hidden world he was now a part of? It sounded absurd, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like a possibility. The letter, the woman, the sudden feeling that something had shifted in his life, it all pointed to something bigger, something out of his control. The days passed in a blur. Every morning, he woke up with the same weight pressing down on him, the same feeling that he was missing something crucial. The city around him felt different, distant, almost like it wasn't his world anymore. He couldn't escape the nagging sense that he was being watched, or that something was waiting for him just around the corner. And then came the strange phone call. It was a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, a voice on the other end was calm, measured, but there was an underlying tension in the way the words were spoken. "I know what you're looking for," the voice said. "And you're getting closer." But you have to be careful. This isn't something you can take lightly." The line went dead before he could respond, leaving him even more unsettled than before. Who was that? How did they know? And what did they mean by getting closer? Was he getting closer to something dangerous? Or was it something he could handle? The weight of the unknown pressed in on him. He thought about the woman again, about the way she had disappeared so quickly, like she had been a ghost sent to deliver some sort of message. Could it be that she was somehow connected to this strange phone call? Was she part of the same world, or was she simply another pawn in a game he didn't understand? As the days wore on, the sense of unease grew. He couldn't focus on anything, couldn't concentrate on his work, or even his daily routine. Everywhere he went, the feeling of being watched seemed to intensify. It wasn't paranoia. He knew someone or something was out there, tracking his every move. But who? And why? One evening, after a long day of restless searching, he found himself at a local bar, nursing a drink. The dim light, the low murmur of conversation, it was the only place he felt like he could breathe. As he stared into his glass, trying to clear his mind, he noticed something, or rather, someone across the room. It was her again. The woman. This time, she wasn't rushing off. She sat at the bar, alone, her eyes scanning the room with an almost unnerving focus. He couldn't explain why, but he felt an overwhelming pull to go to her. It was like his body knew what his mind couldn't fully comprehend. He stood up, his legs moving on their own accord, as if guided by some invisible force. When he reached her, she didn't look surprised to see him. She gave him a small, almost knowing smile. "You're getting too close," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure what she meant, but the tension in her words was unmistakable. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight. She glanced around the room, her eyes darting to the door, then back to him. "They're watching," she said. "You don't know it yet, but you've stepped into something you can't undo. You're already in too deep." The words sent a chill down his spine. "Who's watching me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. But before she could answer, the door to the bar opened, and a group of people entered, their eyes scanning the room. The woman's gaze flickered toward them, then back to him, and in an instant she was gone. She slipped out of her seat, disappearing into the crowd without a trace. He stood there, stunned, his heart racing. What was she trying to tell him? And why had she left so suddenly? The feeling of being watched intensified, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Whoever they were closing in. He needed answers, but now, he wasn't sure where to turn. Was this all part of some elaborate game? Or had he truly stumbled upon something far more dangerous than he realized? The next few days were a blur. He stayed inside more than usual, avoiding the streets he had once walked so easily. Every knock at the door made his heart race. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The sense of paranoia grew, but it wasn't just in his mind. There were signs, small but unmistakable. A strange car parked across the street for hours at a time. A figure watching him from a distance. The phone calls, now becoming more frequent, but the voice remained silent, never offering any answers. Then came another message. This time, it was slipped under his door, with no note, no signature. Just a single word, written in bold black letters: run. He had no choice but to act. He couldn't ignore it anymore. But as he gathered his things and prepared to leave, the thought of what he was running from gnawed at him. Who was behind all of this? What was their goal? And why had he been chosen? He didn't know, but he could feel the walls closing in. And as he looked out the window, he realized one undeniable truth: wherever he went, whatever he did, it wouldn't be enough to escape what was coming. The moment he saw the word run, everything he had been trying to deny came crashing down on him. He couldn't breathe. His hands shook as he picked up the piece of paper, staring at the single, bold word that seemed to pulse with an urgency he couldn't ignore. Every instinct told him to leave, to get out, to disappear, but where could he go? Who could he trust? The sudden realization hit him like a freight train. Whatever was going on, it wasn't just some random coincidence. He was caught up in something far more dangerous than he had imagined. This wasn't just about a chance encounter on the street or a simple act of kindness. This was a carefully orchestrated game, and he had unknowingly stepped right into its web. He grabbed his bag, throwing together only the essentials, but the thought of running made his chest tighten. Was it even possible to escape? Every road felt like it was leading him deeper into the unknown, and there was no way to know if he'd make it out of this alive, or if he was just running straight into a trap. As he stepped out the door, the world seemed different, darker somehow. He was no longer the person he had been just a week ago. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on him, and the feeling of being watched never left. Every passerby felt like a potential threat. Every car that drove by seemed to be a vehicle on a mission. His pulse quickened, and his mind raced through 100 possible outcomes. Where could he go? Who could he turn to? What was waiting for him? His mind snapped back to the woman, the mysterious figure who had entered his life without warning. Every time he had tried to get closer to her, she had vanished just as quickly. Each time, she had left him with more questions than answers. But now, it wasn't just about her. It was about the people or forces behind this game. Who were they? What did they want? And why had they singled him out? The phone calls had become more frequent, and the silence on the other end of the line only heightened the sense of impending danger. Whoever was behind it all, they were watching him, tracking his every move. The walls were closing in, and no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were always one step ahead. He found himself walking through the streets, trying to shake the feeling of being pursued. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden figure, every turn in the alley felt like a setup. He couldn't go home, couldn't even go to a friend's place. It was no longer about finding a safe place, it was about surviving long enough to understand what was happening. Then came the knock on the door. He froze, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. Who could it be now? His heart thudded in his chest as he approached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He peered through the peephole but saw nothing, just the empty hallway. It was too quiet. Too still. He had a choice: open the door and face whatever was on the other side, or leave, once and for all, without looking back. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but curiosity tugged at him. Maybe this was it, the moment he'd been waiting for, the answers he'd been chasing. Slowly, he opened the door, but no one was there. Instead, there was a small, folded note on the doorstep. His breath caught in his throat as he knelt to pick it up. This time, there was no cryptic message, no warning. Just a location. An address scrawled in hurried handwriting: "Meet me where it all began." The words sent a jolt through him. Where it all began. The street corner. The place where he had helped the woman. But why? Why would they want him to go back there? Was it a trap? Or was this the moment where everything would finally make sense? He had no choice. He had to go. He had to know what was waiting for him there, even if it meant walking straight into the heart of the danger that had been lurking around him for days. He couldn't run anymore. Not without knowing what was at the end of this twisted road. The air felt different as he retraced his steps, each footfall heavy with the knowledge that whatever was going to happen next, it was out of his hands. The city was quieter now, almost too quiet. The usual hum of life had died down, leaving a thick silence that made every sound feel amplified. His footsteps echoed as he walked a familiar path, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him with each step. When he reached the street corner, everything looked the same. The same trees, the same benches, the same feeling of emptiness. He stood there for a moment, scanning the area, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The street was empty, save for a few distant figures walking by. No one was waiting for him, or so it seemed. But then he saw it. A shadow moved in the distance, just outside of his line of sight. His heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. The shadow moved again, closer this time, and he could feel his pulse quicken. This was it. Whoever had been behind this, whoever had been watching him, was here now. It was happening. His eyes locked onto the figure, and in that moment, he felt a strange sense of recognition. It wasn't her, not the woman. But somehow, he knew this person was connected to everything. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a face he hadn't expected. The person was older, their face weathered with age, but there was something familiar in their eyes. "You've been running," the figure said, their voice calm, but with an edge of something darker beneath the surface. "But you're not running anymore, are you?" The words hit him like a punch. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew in that moment that his life was about to change forever. The figure wasn't here to hurt him. Not yet, at least. But they were here to reveal something that had been waiting in the shadows all along. And just as he opened his mouth to ask the question that had been haunting him, the figure raised a hand, silencing him. "Soon," they whispered. "Soon you'll understand everything. But not yet." And with that, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving him standing there, on the edge of a precipice, with the answers so close, but just out of reach. The tension in air was suffocating, and he knew that this was just the beginning. Something bigger was coming. Something that would either destroy him or set him free. And now, he had no choice but to follow wherever it would lead. As the figure vanished into the darkness, he was left standing in the eerie quiet of the street corner, heart racing, his mind spinning with questions. He felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders, the realization dawning that this was bigger than he had ever imagined. He had been warned, but the warning felt like a puzzle piece, one that didn't quite fit into the chaos surrounding him. What did it all mean? Why had he been chosen for this strange, terrifying game? But as he stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of it all, the atmosphere around him shifted. The silence deepened, becoming almost oppressive, like the city itself was holding its breath. He turned to leave, feeling the oppressive weight of the unknown pressing in, when he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure emerged from the shadows. This time, it wasn't the mysterious person who had spoken to him before, it was someone he recognized. It was her. The woman. But she was different. Her once calm and confident demeanor was gone, replaced by something else, something desperate, frantic. Her eyes, once steady and knowing, now flashed with fear. She wasn't running, but she was clearly not herself. "I told you not to come back here," she said, her voice trembling. There was no trace of the composed stranger he had met earlier, only a raw, panic-stricken edge that sent a chill down his spine. "What's going on?" he asked, taking a step toward her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who's behind this? What do you know? Please, I need answers." For a moment, she looked as though she might speak, as though the walls she had carefully built around herself might come down. But instead, she shook her head, looking over her shoulder as if she feared someone or something was watching. "You shouldn't have come here," she repeated, her voice shaky, her body rigid with tension. "They'll be here any minute." He didn't understand. Who? Who's going to be here? What's happening? Before she could respond, a sound in the distance caught his attention. A car engine, revving, growing louder by the second. He instinctively looked over his shoulder, his heart skipping a beat as headlights pierced the dark. The car screeched to a halt a few yards away, and the door swung open. Two figures stepped out. They were tall, dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by the shadows. There was no mistaking the threat in their movements, the way they surveyed the scene as though they were searching for something or someone. His stomach dropped as he realized they were headed straight for him and the woman. Her eyes locked with his, and for a fleeting moment, he saw something else in them, something almost pleading. "Run," she whispered. "Run now." He didn't hesitate. His feet moved before his brain could process what was happening. He turned and bolted down the street, his heart pounding in his chest, the sound of footsteps chasing him echoing behind him. He could hear the voices of the figures behind him, but he didn't dare look back. The alleyways and side streets he knew so well now seemed like a maze, twisting and turning with no clear escape. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed himself harder, faster, but he could hear the footsteps gaining on him, growing closer and closer with every step. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but there was no clear solution. Every instinct screamed that he had to keep running, but it was as though the world around him was closing in, the walls getting tighter with each breath. He was being hunted. But as he rounded a corner, a sharp pain shot through his side, and he stumbled, nearly falling to the ground. He looked down to see blood staining his shirt. The figures weren't just chasing him, they had caught up, and now they were making sure he wouldn't escape. The pain intensified with each breath, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward, willing himself to keep moving despite the injury. The woman's face flashed in his mind. Why had she told him to run? What did she know that he didn't? Had she been trying to protect him? Or had she known all along that this would happen, that he would be drawn into something that he couldn't get out of? He turned another corner, but his body was starting to fail him. His legs felt like lead, and the blood from the wound continued to seep through his clothes. He could hear the footsteps behind him closer now, too close. He had no idea how much longer he could run. Just as his vision began to blur, a door suddenly swung open in front of him. A woman's voice, sharp, commanding, called out from inside. "Get in here, now!" Without thinking, he staggered toward the door, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. The woman grabbed his arm, pulling him inside with surprising strength, slamming the door shut behind them. The figures outside pounded on the door, but the woman didn't flinch. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his mind still racing. The woman who had helped him took a step back, her face now illuminated by the dim light in the room. "You're not safe here," she said, her voice steady, despite the chaos outside. "They'll find you, and when they do, it won't just be your life on the line. You have to understand there's more at stake than you realize. Everything you've been through, everything you've experienced. It's all leading to this moment." He tried to focus, but the world was spinning around him. "Who are you? What's going on? What is this all about?" She looked down at him, her face serious, before she spoke again. "You're not just part of their game. You're the key to it. And if they get their hands on you, everything changes." Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps growing louder filled the room. And then, the door began to shake as if something or someone was trying to break through. The stakes had never been higher. He had just learned that he wasn't just a pawn in this dangerous game, he was its central piece. And now, with no time to think, he realized that escaping this trap would be far more complicated than he ever could have imagined. But as the door rattled once more, he knew one thing: there was no turning back now. The door continued to shake violently, the sound of pounding fists vibrating through the room like thunder. His heart was racing, and with each second that passed, it felt like the walls were closing in around him. The woman who had pulled him inside stood rigid, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for another way out. She didn't look afraid, she looked determined. But there was something in her expression, something almost sad, as though she already knew what was coming. He gritted his teeth and pushed himself up from the floor, trying to steady his breath despite the burning pain in his side. His vision swam, but he couldn't afford to pass out now. Not when everything had come down to this moment. The pounding on the door grew louder, more urgent. Whoever they weren't going to stop until they had him. And worse, whatever they wanted him for, he knew it wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger than just his life. "Listen to me," the woman said, her voice low and firm, cutting through his spiraling thoughts. "You need to make a choice right now. If you want to live, if you want to survive, you have to trust me. Do you understand?" He nodded, though the dizziness made it hard to focus. The truth was, he didn't know who to trust anymore. He had been pulled into a game he didn't understand, where every move seemed like a trap, and everyone he had met had only added more confusion. But now, faced with the threat at the door and with nowhere else to turn, he had to take a chance. The woman grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the back of the room. The pounding grew louder, and the door groaned under the force. "There's a way out. But you need to move fast." No hesitation. He didn't question her. They were running out of time. As she dragged him to a narrow, almost hidden door at the back of the room, he caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. On the wall near the door was a symbol. It was subtle, almost like a logo, but the sight of it sent a chill through him. It was the same symbol he had seen on the envelope earlier, the one that had come with the note telling him to run. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "What is this?" But she didn't answer. Instead, she opened the door and shoved him through, following quickly behind him. The air was cold on the other side, and they were standing in an alleyway. It was dimly lit, and the sound of the pounding at the door still echoed in his ears. She pushed him ahead of her, urging him to keep moving, but he couldn't help but look back over his shoulder. He wasn't ready for what he saw next. The door slammed open, but instead of the two shadowy figures from before, a group of people emerged, moving swiftly and purposefully. They were all dressed in black, their faces obscured, their movements synchronized. There were more of them than he had expected. And in the center of the group was someone he recognized, someone he hadn't seen in days, someone who had been playing the game right along with him. It was the woman. But this time, she was standing with them, her posture different. Her face was blank, devoid of emotion, and she wasn't looking at him. She was looking straight ahead, as if she had already made her choice. A knot tightened in his stomach, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. His eyes flicked between her and the people surrounding her, and the realization hit him with brutal force. She had been one of them all along. The woman who had seemed like an ally, who had pulled him into this world of danger and confusion, was now standing with the very people who had been hunting him. She had known all along what was at stake. She had been playing him, just like everyone else. "Why?" he whispered, his voice thick with betrayal. "Why did you help me? Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" She didn't answer. Her face remained impassive, cold even. One of the figures beside her stepped forward, his voice smooth and confident. "It's over. You've done your part. Now you'll come with us, and you'll forget everything that happened. Or..." His voice trailed off, but implication was clear. If he didn't go with them, there would be consequences. Deadly consequences. He backed away, trying to think of a way out, but the alley seemed to close in around him. There was no way out. He was trapped, and his only choice was to surrender, to go with them and pray that somehow he would survive this twisted game. But before he could take another step, the woman spoke, her voice soft, almost regretful. "I never wanted it to end like this. But you were always meant to be part of this. It's too late to change it now." As the figures closed in on him, his mind raced, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. He had been a pawn in their game from the start. But what did that mean for him now? Was there any way out? And just as the figures reached out to grab him, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath their feet trembled, a low, rumbling sound vibrating through the alley. The figures paused, confusion flashing across their faces. Then, a blinding light appeared at the far end of the alley, growing brighter and brighter until it was almost unbearable to look at. The light expanded rapidly, engulfing everything in its path. The figures reacted in panic, but it was too late. Before he could even comprehend what was happening, the light swallowed them whole. The woman, the figures, and the alley itself, all of it vanished in an instant, leaving nothing but a strange emptiness behind. He stood there, breathing heavily, still reeling from the shock of what had just occurred. His mind struggled to process the sudden shift in reality, the disappearance of everything he had been fighting against. For a moment, he thought he might have imagined it. But then, as the silence settled in, he realized something deeper. The game wasn't over. The people who had orchestrated everything had made their move, and now, he was alone, with only one thing left to do: find out who had pulled the strings and why. But as he turned to walk away, a sharp pain shot through his side once more, and he stumbled. The blood was still there, the wound still fresh. The danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. But now, more than ever, he knew the truth: nothing was as it seemed. And if he had any hope of surviving what was coming next, he was going to need answers, and fast. And just before he disappeared into the darkness, he heard a voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere in the distance. "You can't run anymore." It was her voice. And with those words, everything he thought he knew about this twisted game was turned upside down again. The voice echoed in the alley, distant and haunting, sending a shiver down his spine. "You can't run anymore." He didn't know if it was the woman or something else, but he could feel the weight of the words settle in his chest. There was no escaping whatever this was now. No running. No hiding. But as the echoes of her voice faded, another thought surged forward in his mind. He couldn't stay frozen in fear. This had gone on long enough. He had to find out who was behind this, who had orchestrated everything, and most importantly, why. The weight of the unknown was unbearable now, and every question demanded an answer. He stumbled away from the spot where the figures had disappeared, blood still staining his shirt. His mind was racing, piecing together the broken fragments of the past few days. He had been part of something bigger than he could have imagined, pulled into a game with no rules, no mercy. A game that had tested him in ways he never thought possible. But now, it was time to take control of his own story. He limped through the narrow streets, his breath ragged as he tried to focus. He had to think. Think about everything that had happened. The woman, the symbols, the strange message, everything. There were pieces of the puzzle scattered everywhere, but it wasn't until now that he truly understood the gravity of what he was dealing with. The alleyway led to a street that was quieter than usual, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded moments earlier. The city seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something to happen. The silence, however, was almost oppressive, and he could feel the weight of every step as he made his way through the streets. His destination wasn't clear, but there was one place that had been on his mind ever since he saw the symbol, the place where it had all started. The office. The building. The organization. He had to go there. It was the only place where the answers might lie. He didn't know how long it would take to get there or what he would find when he did, but he couldn't afford to waste time. Every second felt like it was slipping away, and the more he thought about the woman's words, the more it became clear that he was nearing the end of the road. His body was drained. His injury still hurt, but adrenaline kept him moving. He dodged through the busy city streets, eyes darting around, trying to stay alert for anything out of the ordinary. But nothing came. There were no more figures. No more surprises. It almost felt like the game had ended, but he knew better than to believe that. The calm was just the calm before the storm. When he finally reached the building, it looked just as he remembered, cold, imposing, like a fortress. The lights were off inside, but there was a faint glow from the security system at the entrance. His heart raced, knowing that what he was about to do might change everything. But there was no other choice. The answers had to be inside. The door to the building was locked, but he had seen the codes before. He punched in the numbers from memory, watching as the door clicked open. He hesitated for just a moment, his mind flashing to the faces of the people who had been chasing him. They weren't far behind. But he pushed those thoughts aside, knowing that if he didn't act now, he might never get another chance. Inside, the building was just as cold and impersonal as it had been before, the walls lined with sterile white lights and glass panels. But there was something else now. A sense of finality. The deeper he went into the heart of the building, the more certain he became that this was where everything would come to an end. As he walked through the halls, the memories flooded back. The conversations with people who had seemed like allies, the cryptic messages that had sent him on a path of confusion, the way he had been manipulated from the start. It had all been a game, but it was one he had been playing without ever knowing the rules. He reached the room at the back of the building, the one that had always been off limits. The door was locked, but there was no code to punch in this time. Instead, there was a keycard, left on a desk just inside. He grabbed it and swiped it through the reader, the door unlocking with a soft click. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with monitors and computers displaying streams of data. The air felt thick with tension, as though something monumental was about to unfold. And it was then that he saw her again. The woman. She was sitting at a desk, facing the monitors, her back to him. Her posture was rigid, focused, as though she had been waiting for him all along. Her presence was undeniable. She had been part of all of this, the mysterious game, the people hunting him, the secret organization. And now, here she was again, the key to everything. He stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this? Why? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" She didn't turn around at first. But when she spoke, her voice was calm, almost too calm. "Because you weren't meant to know until now. You were never supposed to figure it out." The finality in her words hit him hard, the weight of everything falling into place. She had been a player in this game from the start, but she was also a pawn, just like him. She had been following orders, just like he had. And now, she was here, ready to deliver the final blow or perhaps reveal the final piece of the puzzle. "You're not the only one who's been manipulated," she continued, her voice steady but filled with something he couldn't quite place. "You weren't supposed to survive this long. But you did. And now we're both stuck in it, whether we like it or not." The pieces clicked together in his mind. The organization, the game, the pursuit, it had all been leading to this. But it was bigger than just them. It was bigger than any of them had imagined. They were all part of something far more dangerous than they had realized. And the people pulling the strings had never intended for anyone to walk away. He stepped closer, the tension in the room thickening. "Who are they? Who's behind all of this? Why were we chosen?" She turned slowly to face him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a deep breath, she answered, her voice barely audible. "They're the ones who control everything. And they're the ones who decide who lives and who dies. You and I? We were just pawns in their game. But now we've become something more." Her words hung in the air, a mix of finality and resignation. He felt the weight of them, the truth sinking in. He hadn't been the only one in the dark. She had been, too. They had both been part of a larger, more sinister plan, manipulated and controlled by an unseen force. But now, they were standing at the crossroads of their own futures, and the game had reached its end. He stood in the room, his mind spinning with the implications. There was no easy answer. No simple escape. But one thing was clear: he had survived. And for now, that was enough. The story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There would be more to uncover. More to fight for. But for now, he had the answers he had been searching for. As he turned to leave, the woman spoke one last time, her voice steady. Don't think you've won. You may have survived this round, but they will come for you. And next time it won't be so easy. He nodded, his eyes focused on the door. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this: he wouldn't be a pawn anymore. The game had changed. And now, he was in control. He walked out of the building, the night air cool against his skin. There were no more games. Only the truth. And whatever came next, he would face it head on. Because in the end, that's all any of them had ever done: fight to survive. And now, it was his turn to write the final chapter.